The stagecoach groaned like a dying animal as it clawed its way through the last few miles of blistering, red earth. Inside, Clara Monroe felt every jolt in her bones, a dull ache that mirrored the one lodged deep in her chest. She pressed her face against the hot glass, peering out at a land so empty it seemed to have been forgotten by God himself. When the coach finally shuddered to a halt, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and hardship, grunted, "This is it, ma'am, redemption." Clara stepped down into a world painted in shades of rust and bone. The name of the town was a cruel joke. There was no redemption here, only decay. The main street was a wide, forsaken river of dust, flanked by buildings that sagged with a weary resignation. Broken fences leaned like tired old men, and on the hills that ringed the town, the skeletal remains of mining derricks clawed at the empty blue sky, monuments to a boom that had long since gone bust. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, howled through the gaps in their timbers, a sound like 1,000 weeping ghosts. It swept dust into her eyes and mouth, a gritty taste of failure. This place was a reflection of her own soul, hollowed out, abandoned, and haunted by what it had lost. A woman with a face as pinched and unforgiving as the landscape emerged from a 2-story boarding house, the only building that seemed to have any fight left in it. She wiped her hands on a gray apron, her eyes narrowing as they took in Clara's city dress, now coated in a fine layer of ochre dust. "You the one from the letter?" the woman asked, her voice as dry as the ground beneath their feet. "I am Clara Monroe." "Martha Finch," the woman stated, not as an introduction, but as a fact. "Rooms on the 2nd floor, $2 a week. Pay in advance. No cooking in the rooms, no gentlemen callers, and I expect quiet after 9. Clara followed her inside. The air was thick with the scent of boiled cabbage and lye soap. It was clean, brutally so, but threadbare. The floorboards creaked with every step, protesting the weight of her grief. Mrs. Finch led her to a small room containing a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a single window that looked out onto the forsaken street. "It will do," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mrs." Finch grunted again. "Most of my boarders are widows, or women whose husbands have run off. This town is good at making both. The other kind are drifters, passing through to somewhere better." She gave Clara a long, assessing look. "Hard to tell which you are." Clara offered no explanation. She let the woman's words hang in the air, another weight to add to the rest. In the days that followed, she learned that silence was a language in redemption, but whispers were its currency. When she walked to the general store for a bar of soap and a loaf of bread, conversations would die as she entered. The storekeeper was polite enough, but his eyes were full of a cold curiosity she recognized. She saw the women of the town, their faces drawn and weary, huddled together after she passed, their hushed words carried on the wind. They knew. News traveled faster than any stagecoach. They knew she was the widow of Arthur Monroe, the man whose grand ambitions and foolish risks had led to a mine collapse back east. A disaster that had not only claimed his life, but had wiped out the fortunes of a dozen families, including her own. They looked at her and saw not a grieving widow, but the architect of their own potential ruin, a reminder of how quickly a woman could fall from grace. Her reputation preceded her, a ghost that had arrived in town long before she was a pariah, marked by a failure that wasn't even her own. But what they did not know, what no one could know, was the cavernous relief that had opened inside her the day she learned Arthur was dead. The whispers of the town were a soft hum compared to the silent scream of guilt that was her constant companion. A few days after her arrival, she sought out the town cemetery. It was a bleak, wind-swept plot of land just beyond the half-burned skeleton of what was once a church. The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, many of them leaning, surrendering to the relentless wind. It took her a while to find it, a marker newer than the others. The name Arthur Monroe, carved into the raw wood by an unsteady hand. His partners, the ones who had lost everything alongside him, had at least paid to have his body shipped west for burial in the town he had intended to conquer. She stood before the grave, her hands clasped tight, but no tears came. There was no sorrow here, only a cold, hard knot of guilt. She felt guilty not for his death, but for her profound lack of love for him in life. She had married him for security, for the promise of a comfortable life that his charm and ambition had seemed to guarantee. But his ambition was a fire without warmth, consuming everything it touched. He had been a man of grand pronouncements and empty affections, and she had been another of his beautiful acquisitions. His death in that fiery explosion felt less like a tragedy and more like a reckoning. Standing over his grave in this desolate land was her penance, a quiet acknowledgement of the lie she had lived for 5 years. She did not mourn the man. She mourned the years she had lost, the person she had ceased to be while shackled to his dreams. After a long while, she turned and walked away, leaving the wind to whisper its eulogy to the uncaring dust. That night, the town of Redemption showed its other face. By day, it was a ghost town, slumbering in the oppressive heat. But as darkness fell, the saloon, the dust devil, came alive. A discordant piano melody spilled out onto the street, along with harsh laughter and the raw shouts of men trying to forget their miserable lives one drink at a time. Clara sat by her window, the faint light from her single candle casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. The noise from the saloon was a dull roar, a beast stirring in the heart of the town. Suddenly, the roar sharpened. The laughter turned to curses, the shouts to threats. She watched as 2 figures stumbled out of the saloon's swinging doors, grappling in the dirt. One was large and loud, swinging his fists like clumsy hammers. The other was leaner, quieter, moving with a grim economy of motion. The shouting escalated, a torrent of slurred accusations and foul promises. Then, in a moment of shocking clarity, there was a single, deafening crack. It wasn't like the thunderous volleys she had read about in dime novels. It was a sharp, ugly sound that ripped through the night and left a ringing silence in its wake. The larger man, Jebediah Stone, she would later learn, crumpled to the ground without a sound, a dark stain spreading across his chest in the moonlight. The other man remained standing. He did not move, did not run. He simply stood over the body, a revolver held loosely at his side, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel like a departing spirit. The moonlight caught his profile as he slowly raised his head. Even from her window, Clara could see the weariness in his posture. He was not a triumphant victor. He looked like a man who had just performed a necessary, soul-crushing chore. He put a cigarette to his lips, his hand steady as he struck a match, the brief flare illuminating a hard, scarred face before he was once again consumed by shadow. The marshal, Gideon Hayes, eventually emerged, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no urgency, no shock. A small crowd gathered, their faces pale and curious in the moonlight. They dragged the body away, and the marshal spoke a few low words to the man with the gun. The man just nodded, took a long drag from his cigarette, and melted back into the darkness at the edge of town. The next morning, the whispers were about him. "That was Eli Carter, Mrs." Finch said, slamming a plate of dry toast on the table in front of Clara. "Another one for him. Town's better off without Jeb Stone, drunkard and a cheat that he was. Still, Carter's got a heavy hand." Clara heard his name spoken in the general store, a mixture of fear and a strange, grudging respect. He was a killer, they said, a man who had seen too much in the war and had brought its violence back with him. He lived alone in a small shack on the outskirts of town, working when he had to for a hard-nosed rancher named Haskins. Keeping to himself, he was a ghost of a different sort, a living one who haunted the edges of their society. Clara saw him a few days later, He was replacing a shoe on a sway-backed horse outside the blacksmith's shop. She watched from across the street, pretending to inspect the faded fabrics in the mercantile window. He was tall, but he held himself in a way that seemed to diminish his height. His shoulders slightly stooped as if carrying an invisible weight. A long, thin scar ran from his temple down his cheek, disappearing into the stubble on his jaw. His hands, as he worked on the horse's hoof, were steady and surprisingly gentle. He spoke to the animal in a low murmur, a soft rumble that was lost to the wind, but the horse stood calm and pliant under his touch. When he finished, he ran a hand along the animal's neck, a gesture of quiet communion. In that moment, Clara saw not a killer, but a man drowning in a profound solitude. His eyes, when he briefly glanced up, were not cold. They were empty, like the landscape around them, haunted by things she could not imagine. She saw something of her own desolation mirrored in them, and it unsettled her more than any story of the men he had killed. The small boarding house had a little patch of land out back, enclosed by a rickety picket fence. It was where Mrs. Finch grew a few hardy vegetables and hung her laundry. One afternoon, as Clara sat on the back step, trying to lose herself in a book she'd read a dozen times, she heard the creak of the gate. It was Eli Carter. He stood just inside the yard, his hat in his hands. He looked out of place, a creature of dust and shadow trespassing in a world of laundry and wilted lettuces. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rasp, unused to pleasantries. He nodded toward a section of the fence where two of the pickets had broken, leaving a gap. "Fence is broken." Clara's heart gave a sudden, sharp thump. She stood up, smoothing down her dress, her posture immediately defensive. She was a Monroe. She might be ruined, but she was not helpless. "I am aware," she said, her tone colder than she intended. "I will see to it." He looked at the broken wood, then back at her. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, crossed his face before it was gone. "Got some spare lumber. Won't take long to fix." It was an offer of kindness, simple and direct, but coming from him, from the man she had seen kill another without a flicker of emotion. It felt like a threat. It was a violation of the unspoken lines that had been drawn in this town. He was the outcast killer. She was the disgraced widow. Their worlds were not supposed to touch. "That will not be necessary," she said, lifting her chin. "I can manage my own affairs, Mr. Carter." He held her gaze for a long moment. His eyes were a startlingly pale gray, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't argue or insist. He simply turned, put his hat back on his head, and walked away, closing the gate softly behind him. His quiet persistence, followed by his even quieter retreat, left her feeling strangely shaken. He hadn't behaved like the monster the town described. He had behaved like a gentleman. The town marshal found her later that day. Gideon Hayes was a man whose tired eyes had seen the worst of everything this land had to offer. He removed his hat as he approached her on the porch. "Mrs. Monroe," he began, his voice weary but kind. "I couldn't help but notice you speaking with Eli Carter earlier." "He pointed out a broken fence," Clara said stiffly. The marshal sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Ma'am, I ain't one to meddle, but I feel it's my duty to offer a word of caution. Eli is, well, he carries a lot of trouble with him. From the war, from before. He's not a bad man, not deep down, but violence follows him like a shadow. It's best for a lady like yourself to keep a wide berth." The warning was meant to protect her. She knew. It was the sensible, logical thing to do. Any respectable woman would heed it. But Clara's life was no longer respectable, and logic had done nothing to soothe the aching loneliness that gnawed at her night and day. The marshal's words, like the town's whispers, only served to stoke a tiny, dangerous flame of defiance within her. He was the one person in this town who had offered her a simple, human courtesy without wanting anything in return. That night, sleep would not come. The silence of her room felt suffocating. She rose from her bed and went to the window. Pulling back the thin curtain, the moon was high and full, bathing the dead town in a silvery, ethereal light. And then she saw him. Down in the yard, bathed in that same moonlight, was the dark silhouette of Eli Carter. He was fixing the fence. She could hear the rhythmic, muffled thud of a hammer striking wood, a sound that was steady and sure in the vast, empty quiet of the night. He worked alone, without an audience, asking for no thanks or payment. He was simply mending what was broken. Clara stood there for what felt like hours, a solitary watcher at her window. Her candle, sitting on the small table beside her, flickered and danced. Its warm, wavering light cast shifting patterns on her face, illuminating the turmoil in her eyes. Out there, in the cold moonlight, was a man the world called a killer, but all she saw was a quiet strength, a silent act of grace in a graceless world. And as the candlelight played across her skin, it felt like a mirror to the strange, unsettling warmth that was beginning to flicker deep inside her own broken heart. The quiet rhythm of the town began to reveal its secrets to Clara. She learned that the lean, hard-faced man who owned the largest ranch in the territory was Silas Haskins. She saw him once, riding a fine black horse down the main street, his face a mask of sour authority. The men in his employ, their shoulders stooped with fatigue, gave him a wide berth. Whispers in the general store painted a picture of a man who measured loyalty in sweat and paid for it in pennies. He was known for docking a week's wages for a lame horse or a broken tool, and his temper was as sudden and violent as a prairie thunderstorm. And it was for this man, she learned, that Eli Carter worked. She began to see Eli more often, though always at a distance. He moved at the edges of the day, a solitary figure riding out at dawn and returning after dusk, covered in the dust of Haskins's vast, unforgiving land. His life, from what she could gather, was a spare and lonely thing. He tended horses, mended the endless miles of fence that crisscrossed the scrubland, and when the day was done, he drank alone, either in the corner of the saloon or from a bottle in his own quiet shack. He spoke to almost no one, and no one spoke to him unless they had to. He was a fixture of the town, like the howling wind or the skeletal mines, a presence that was accepted but never embraced. But there was another part of his life that no one in Redemption saw, in the quiet of his small, one-room cabin, lit by the flickering orange glow of a kerosene lamp. Eli would sometimes pull a small, folded packet from a worn leather pouch. Inside was a letter, the paper softened and creased from countless foldings and unfoldings. The ink was faded, the words written in a careful, almost childish hand. It was addressed to his younger brother, Caleb. The letter was a confession, a rambling, incoherent apology for a single, terrible moment in the chaos of a battlefield. It spoke of smoke and fear, of a mistaken shadow, and a trigger pulled too soon. He had never sent it. He could not. The grave it was meant for was 1,000 miles away, and the guilt it contained was buried so deep inside him that no words could ever truly excavate it. The letter was his penance and his prison, a constant reminder of the life he had taken and the piece of his own soul that had died with it. Clara, driven by a desperate need for purpose, decided to create a small corner of hope in the heart of the town's decay. The church, half burned in a fire years ago, still had one section of its roof intact. The inside smelled of ash and rain, but it was a space, a shelter from the relentless sun. She swept the floors, cleared the debris, and announced to the town that she would be holding classes for any child who wished to learn to read and write. At first, only 3 children came, their faces smudged with dirt and their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and shyness. They were the children of a blacksmith and a washerwoman, parents who held on to the fragile hope that a little learning might give their offspring a better chance than this dying town had given them. Clara taught them their letters, drawing them in the dust on the floorboards, her voice soft but steady in the cavernous, broken building. A week into her endeavor, as she was trying to prop up a splintered bench, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Eli Carter standing in the doorway, his silhouette stark against the bright, unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun. He said nothing. He simply walked past her, picked up the broken bench, and carried it outside. He returned with a hammer and some nails he produced from a leather roll. In the corner of the ruined sanctuary, he began to work. The sound of his hammer was a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the soft murmur of her teaching. He did not speak to her, did not even look at her, but his presence was a solid, reassuring thing. The children watched him with a fearful fascination, but he paid them no mind. When he was finished, the bench was solid and true. He set it back in its place and then, without a word, began to work on another. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He replaced the rotten floorboards near the entrance, patched a hole in the remaining roof, and began the slow, arduous task of rebuilding the heavy oak door that had been torn from its hinges. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his movements economical and precise. He was building, creating order from chaos. And Clara found herself watching his hands, scarred and calloused, yet so capable as they worked the wood. His silence was a comfort, a shared space that needed no words. He was helping her, and in doing so, he was becoming a part of her small, fragile world. Then the storm came. It began as a strange, yellow haze on the horizon, a sickly tint to the endless blue of the sky. The wind, usually a constant moan, fell silent, creating an eerie, breathless stillness. The air grew thick and heavy, and the birds vanished. An unnatural twilight descended, and the world took on the color of old parchment. "A duster," Eli said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had spoken to her in days. He was securing a loose shutter on one of the church windows. "It will be a bad one." He looked at her, his pale gray eyes serious. "You should not be out in this. My place is closer than the boarding house." Clara hesitated, her heart quickening. To go with him, to his home, it was a line she knew she should not cross. But as she looked outside, she saw the world begin to dissolve. The horizon was gone, swallowed by a roiling, monstrous wall of brown dust that was racing toward them. The wind returned with a sudden, violent shriek, and the air filled with stinging sand. "The stable," he said, his voice raised over the rising scream of the wind. "The blacksmith's. It's stone. It will hold." He took her arm, his grip firm but not rough, and pulled her out of the church. The world outside was a nightmare. The sun was a dim, coppery coin in a sky of churning dirt. Sand whipped at their faces, blinding and painful. Eli hunched his shoulders, shielding her with his body as they fought their way across the street. The stable was a dark maw, and he pushed her inside just as the full fury of the storm hit. The great wooden door slammed shut behind them, plunging them into a warm, hay-scented darkness. The sound of the world outside was terrifying, a continuous, deafening roar, like a great beast trying to claw its way in. Dust seeped through the cracks in the walls, creating hazy shafts of light where the dim lanterns glowed. They stood there for a moment, catching their breath, their clothes and hair thick with grit. The stable was a sanctuary, an island of calm in a sea of chaos. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, their soft snorts and the stomp of their hooves the only sounds in the sudden quiet. Eli led her to a pile of clean hay in an empty stall. They sat down, the roar of the storm a constant presence beyond the thick stone walls. For a long time, they did not speak. There was nothing to say. The storm said it all, stripping away pretense and leaving only the simple, primal need for shelter. In the shared silence, surrounded by the warmth of the animals and the smell of hay and leather, Clara felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. It was a comfort born of shared peril, a connection forged in the heart of the tempest. "I stood at my husband's grave the other day," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the howl of the wind. She did not know why she was telling him this. The words just came. "I did not cry." Eli looked at her, his face shadowed and unreadable in the lantern light. He waited. "He was not a good man to me," she continued, the confession a painful stone she was finally dislodging from her throat. "Not cruel, not in the way some men are, but he was careless with my heart. He saw me as an asset, something to be displayed. When he died, when I lost everything, the guilt was not for his death. It was because I felt free. Is that a terrible thing?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rasp. "I have not prayed since the war," he said. It was not a direct answer to her question, but she understood it was his own confession, an offering of his own brokenness to match hers. "I do not think God listens to men like me." They sat in silence again. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the weight of their shared truths, the quiet acknowledgement of two souls adrift in a world that had shown them little kindness. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the stable, for the first time since she had arrived in this desolate land, Clara did not feel entirely alone. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world scoured and clean, bathed in a soft, pale light. It had buried fences, filled wells with sand, and left a thick blanket of dust on everything. When Clara and Eli emerged from the stable, the town was quiet, as if holding its breath. But it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of watching eyes. By noon, the whispers had begun. They were carried from the saloon to the general store, from the mercantile to the boarding house. Clara Monroe, the disgraced widow from the East, had spent the night with the killer, Eli Carter. The story grew with each telling, twisting an act of shelter into a night of sin. The consequences were swift and brutal. That afternoon, the blacksmith came to the church, his face a mixture of shame and stubborn pride. He told Clara his daughter would not be returning for her lessons. An hour later, the washerwoman did the same. Her small school, her one piece of hope, was dismantled in a single afternoon by the poison of gossip. The final blow came from Mrs. Finch. She was waiting for Clara on the porch of the boarding house, her arms crossed, her face set like granite. "I run a respectable house. Mrs. Monroe," she said, her voice cold and flat. "Or I try to. I cannot have my boarders consorting with the likes of Eli Carter. It gives the place a bad name." "Nothing happened?" Clara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "There was a storm. He gave me shelter." "I have no doubt," Mrs. Finch replied, her thin lips twisting into a semblance of a sneer. "But it is what people think that matters in a town like this, and they are thinking the worst. I will need your room by the end of the week." The word struck Clara like a physical blow. She was being cast out, truly and completely. She had lost her students, her home, her last fragile foothold in this unforgiving world. That evening, the saloon was buzzing with the story. A man named Silas Croft, one of Haskins' ranch hands and a man known for his cruel tongue, was holding court, his voice loud and slurred with drink. He was describing in lurid detail what he imagined had happened between the widow and the gunman in the stable. He did not see Eli Carter enter. Eli moved with a silence that was unnerving, his presence a sudden cold spot in the warm, smoky room. He walked directly to Croft's table. "You have a loud mouth." "Croft," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. Croft, emboldened by whiskey and an audience, sneered up at him. "Just telling the truth. Carter, everyone knows that high and mighty widow ain't so pure." Bet she was grateful for a real man after that soft city husband of hers. Eli's fist moved so fast it was a blur. The crack of knuckles on jawbone echoed through the silent saloon. Croft tumbled backward off his chair, spitting a tooth onto the filthy floorboards. Eli stood over him, his body coiled with a cold, controlled rage. He did not say another word. He simply turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He had defended her honor, but in doing so, he had only cemented his own reputation as a violent man, and hers as a woman who inspired it. Clara heard about the fight the next morning, filled with a desperate, helpless anger. She walked to the edge of town, to the small, dilapidated shack that Eli called home. She found him outside, splitting firewood, the rhythmic swing of the axe a testament to his contained fury. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice shaking. She stood several feet away, hugging her arms to herself. He stopped, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He did not look at her. "He was speaking ill of you." "And what do you think this has done?" she cried, the tears she had refused to shed for her husband now burning in her eyes. "It has made everything worse. They already thought the worst of us, and you have just proven them right. Mrs. Finch is making me leave. I have nowhere to go. Your fight did not help me. It has ruined me." He turned then and looked at her, his face grim, his gray eyes holding hers with a raw intensity. He took a step toward her, and she flinched back. He stopped. "I don't regret it," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper that was somehow more powerful than any shout. The simple finality of his words silenced her. He was not sorry. He would do it again. He had stood for her, and he would accept the consequences, just as he accepted everything else in his life, with a grim, weary resolve. She stared at him, at the scars on his face and the deep-seated pain in his eyes, and saw not a ruffian, but a man who had offered her the only kind of protection he knew how to give. She turned and fled, unable to bear the weight of his gaze, the weight of his sacrifice. That night, in her cold, lonely room, Clara dreamed. She did not dream of the whispers or the angry faces. She dreamed of the stable, of the warm darkness and the sound of the storm. She dreamed of Eli's hands, calloused and scarred, as they fixed the broken benches of her church. She dreamed of the scent of him, a mixture of dust, leather, and the faint, lingering smell of campfire smoke. In her dream, he reached for her, his touch not rough but achingly gentle, a promise of comfort in a world that offered none. She awoke with a gasp, her face wet with tears. A sob escaped her, a broken, wretched sound in the silent room. She was crying not for what she had lost, but for what she was beginning to want. She was terrified of him, of the ruin he represented, of the final, complete fall from grace that he promised. But a deeper, more frightening truth echoed in the hollow chambers of her heart. She was more terrified of living without him. The desire for him was a dangerous, flickering candle in the darkness of her soul, and she feared, with every fiber of her being, that she no longer had the strength to put it out. True to Mrs. Finch's word, Clara found her meager belongings on the boarding house porch at the end of the week. The town had closed its doors to her. Every respectable room was suddenly occupied, every landlady suddenly wary of the trouble a lone woman could bring. The only place that would have her was a small, derelict cabin on the far side of town, nestled against the foot of the hills where the failed mines stood like skeletal sentinels. It was little more than a shack, abandoned by a prospector who had either struck it rich or died trying. The rent was a pittance, paid to a man who lived in the next county and was just glad to have someone keep the roof from caving in completely. Her world shrank to the size of that single dusty room. Isolation became her new companion, a constant, heavy presence that sat with her from the gray light of dawn to the deep, star-filled black of night. The women of the town, who had once whispered behind their hands, now offered a more direct cruelty. They would cross the street to avoid walking on the same side as her, pulling their children close as if she were afflicted with some visible plague. When she entered the general store, a chilling silence would fall, and the storekeeper, Mr. Gable, would serve her with a brusque efficiency, his eyes fixed on a point just over her shoulder. She was a ghost in their midst, a living embodiment of sin and ruin. Her savings, already meager, dwindled with alarming speed. The education and manners that had defined her life back east were useless currency here. Survival was a blunter, more practical affair. She had one skill left that this town might value. She put a small, hand-lettered sign in her window, "Mending and sewing done." Her first customers were the women from the Dust Devil Saloon, their faces hard under layers of paint, their voices rough. They brought her torn lace and split seams, paying her in coins that smelled of whiskey and cheap perfume. They did not judge her. They had their own sins to contend with. Then came the ranch hands, rough men with shy eyes, who would hand over their ripped shirts and trousers in awkward silence. She sat for hours on end, her back aching, her fingers pricked and raw, working by the dim light of her one window. Each stitch was a tiny act of defiance, a refusal to simply lie down and let this town, this life, bury her. She barely spoke to anyone, and no one spoke to her. The world had become a silent, lonely place, punctuated only by the snip of her scissors and the whisper of thread through cloth. But in that silence, a new language began to form. It started one morning when she opened her door to find a small, neat stack of firewood on her step. It was dry pine and oak, far better than the scrub she had been gathering from the hills. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who had left it. There were no tracks in the dust, no sign of his presence, only the gift itself. A few days later, a freshly dressed rabbit appeared in the same spot, hanging from a leather thong, then a small sack of potatoes, and another of flour. They were left in the pre-dawn hours, offerings from a ghost. She never saw him, but she felt his presence. He was watching over her from a distance, a silent, solitary guardian. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, she would look up from her sewing and see him on the ridge behind her cabin, a dark silhouette against the blood-red sky. He would be sitting on his horse, perfectly still, simply watching. He was too far away to see his face, but she knew he was looking at her small, lonely cabin. Their eyes would meet across that vast, empty space, and for a fleeting moment, the distance between them would collapse. In those moments, a silent conversation took place. He asked if she was all right. She answered that she was still here. It was a language of presence, not words. A quiet acknowledgement that in this whole, forsaken town, they were the only two people who truly saw each other. His silent care became a lifeline, a thread of warmth in her cold, isolated existence. She would leave a small portion of whatever she cooked on the porch for him in the evening, a gesture of thanks he would never acknowledge but that she knew he received. The plate would be gone by morning. The autumn rains began without fanfare, a slow, persistent drizzle that turned the red dust to a thick, clinging mud. For days, the sky was a sheet of leaden gray. The world seemed to weep, its sorrow seeping into the very boards of Clara's little cabin. The roof, which had been little more than a suggestion of shelter, began to protest. First, a single, fat drop of water fell onto her table, then another and another. Soon, a steady drip became a dozen, then a score. The rhythmic patter was the sound of her small world dissolving. She moved her bed, her sewing, her few meager possessions, trying to find a dry corner. But the leaks were everywhere. The sound of the rain was no longer a comfort but a threat. Late in the afternoon, with a groan of sodden, rotten wood, a whole section of the roof over the main room gave way. A torrent of muddy water poured in, drenching everything. Clara cried out in despair, a raw, helpless sound that was swallowed by the storm. She rushed to save what she could, her movements frantic and useless against the deluge. She was soaked to the skin, shivering with cold and a profound, soul-deep hopelessness. This was it. This was the final surrender. And then he was there. He did not knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of rain and wet earth. He stood for a moment, his pale eyes taking in the scene, the collapsed roof, the spreading pools of water, and her, standing in the middle of it all, trembling and defeated. He did not speak. There was no need. He moved past her, his boots splashing in the water on the floor, and threw a heavy, oilskin tarp over the gaping hole. The cascade of water slowed to a determined drip. Then he went back outside, into the relentless downpour. He returned moments later with a ladder, a hammer, and a sack of tools. By the fading light of the day, he climbed onto the roof. Clara stood inside, listening to the sure, steady thud of his hammer above her, a sound that cut through the drumming of the rain. It was the sound of order being imposed on chaos, of strength pushing back against despair. As darkness fell, the hammering continued. She lit her last candle and held it up for him, her arm aching, so he could see to work. She watched him, her protector in the storm. The candlelight cast his face in a dramatic play of shadow and light. It illuminated the sharp line of his jaw, the concentration in his eyes, the way the rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead. She saw the raw strength in his shoulders and back as he worked, a strength he used not for violence, but to build, to mend. And in that moment, something inside her shifted, a final wall of defense crumbling to dust. This feeling she had for him, this powerful, magnetic pull, it was not gratitude. Gratitude was a polite, civilized emotion. This was something far more raw, more primal. It was need, a desperate, aching need for his presence, for his quiet solidity, for the safety she felt when he was near. She needed him like she needed air to breathe, like she needed warmth in the freezing cold. When he finally came down, water streamed from his hair and clothes, forming a puddle at his feet. The hammering had stopped. The roof was patched and secure. The storm still raged outside, a wild, angry beast. But inside the small cabin, it was quiet and dry. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. He looked as if he were about to turn and leave, to melt back into the stormy darkness from which he had come. The thought of being alone again was unbearable. "Stay," she said, the word escaping her before she could stop it. "Please, until the storm passes." He looked up at her then, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. He knew what she was asking, what it meant for them both. Staying was a transgression, a final step across a line they had been circling for weeks. He was her ruin, and she was his. He hesitated, his jaw tight. A long, low rumble of thunder shook the small cabin, as if voicing the turmoil between them. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right." She gave him a dry blanket to wrap around his shoulders, and he sat in the one chair that had remained dry while she sat on the edge of her bed. The single candle on the table between them was their only light, a tiny, flickering star in the intimate darkness. The world outside, with its whispers and its judgments, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the rain on the newly mended roof and the charged silence between them. "Did you ever love someone?" she asked, the question soft, tentative. He stared into the candle flame, his expression unreadable. "Once," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Before the war, she was a farmer's daughter, smelled of sunshine and apples. We were to be married." He paused, the silence stretching. "The war changed me. When I came back, I was different. The man she'd loved was gone. I let her go." "And you?" he asked, turning his pale gaze on her. "Did you love your husband?" The question was blunt, but she did not flinch. He had earned the right to ask it. "I thought I did," she confessed. "Or I tried to, but it was a shallow thing. Love should not feel like a cage. It should not feel like a duty. With him, it was both." She looked at him, her heart aching with a truth she had never spoken aloud. I think real love is quieter than that, steadier. They talked for hours, their voices low, weaving their stories of loss and guilt together in the candlelight. They spoke of sin, of the marks it leaves on a soul, of the fear that redemption is a place you can never reach. He spoke of the brother he had lost, the guilt a shadow that never left him. She spoke of her relief at her husband's death, a sin of the heart she felt she could never be forgiven for. They were two broken people, confessing their trespasses in the sanctuary of the storm. The candle burned lower and lower, the flame sputtering, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The storm outside began to soften, its fury abating. But the storm inside the cabin was reaching its peak. The air was thick with everything they had said and everything they had not. Clara looked at him, at this silent, scarred man who had mended her fence, her church, her roof, and was slowly, terrifyingly, mending her soul. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the need was an all-consuming fire. She could not fight it anymore. She did not want to. She rose from the bed and stood before him. She was trembling, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear. "I shouldn't want a cowboy," she whispered, her words a final, shuddering surrender to the truth. "But I need one." He rose slowly from the chair, his eyes searching hers in the dying light. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent, and it sent a tremor through her entire body. He did not kiss her then. Instead, he simply drew her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. She rested her head against him, breathing in the scent of rain and wood smoke and him. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. This was not a clash of passion, but a quiet, desperate coming together. It was two solitudes merging, two halves of a broken whole finding a fragile, temporary peace. In the darkness, surrounded by the soft patter of the dying storm, they sought solace in each other's arms, a silent, tender intimacy born of shared pain and a desperate, forbidden need. The world outside, with all its cruelty, faded to a distant murmur. Morning came too soon, a cool, gray light filtering through the small window. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. But with the light came the harsh, undeniable reality of their situation. Regret, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm haze of the night. Clara sat up in bed, pulling the thin blanket around her, and looked at Eli as he slept in the chair. In sleep, his face was younger. The lines of weariness and pain softened. The fear came rushing back, a suffocating tide. What had she done? She saw the faces of the townswomen, heard their vicious whispers. She was truly fallen now, beyond any hope of redemption. Panic seized her. He stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He looked at her, and for a moment, there was a softness in his gaze she had never seen before. Then he saw the fear in her eyes, and a shudder came down, his expression becoming a familiar, unreadable mask. "You should go," she said, her voice a strained whisper. She could not look at him. "Before anyone sees." The words were a betrayal, and she felt them like a knife in her own heart. She was pushing away the only kindness she had known, sacrificing the man who had sheltered her to save herself from a judgment that had already been passed. He did not argue. He did not say a word. She heard him rise, the soft sounds of him pulling on his boots, gathering his things. He moved with a heavy, weary grace. He had expected this. A man like him was not meant for the morning light. When she finally dared to look up, he was standing at the door. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his face etched with a profound, quiet sorrow. Then he was gone. Later that day, alone in his shack, Eli Carter pulled his gun belt from the nail on the wall. He sat on the edge of his cot and took a small, sharp knife from his pocket. He unbuckled the holster, turning it over in his hands, Then, on the soft, unfinished leather of the inner flap, where it would rest against his own body, hidden from the world, he began to carve, with slow, deliberate strokes. He etched her name into the leather, C-L-A-R-A. It was not a brand of ownership, but a secret vow, a permanent mark on his soul, a name he would carry with him into every lonely battle yet to come. Silas Haskins was not a man who missed much, especially when it came to the lives of the men he employed. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and a distracted ranch hand was a liability. He had noticed the change in Eli Carter. The man's usual impenetrable solitude had been breached. He had seen Carter's gaze drift toward the edge of town, toward the small, derelict cabin where the disgraced widow lived. He had heard the whispers in the saloon, the same ugly gossip that everyone else had heard. For Haskins, it was a simple equation. The woman was trouble, and Carter was his best hand. The trouble had to be eliminated. He cornered Eli in the corral late one afternoon, as Eli was rubbing down a sweat-streaked mare. Haskins dismounted from his own fine horse, his spurs jingling with an air of self-importance. "Carter," he said, his voice a low drawl that dripped with condescension. "I've been hearing things." Eli continued his work, his movement slow and deliberate, running the cloth over the mare's flank. He said nothing. Haskins's lips curled into a sneer. "Hearing that you've taken a shine to that Monroe woman, the ruined one from back east." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Eli's boots. "A man in your position ought to aim a little lower. There are girls at the saloon who'd be happy for the attention. Cheaper, too. And they don't come with a dead husband's reputation clinging to them like a bad smell." Eli's hand stopped moving. He stood up slowly, turning to face his employer. His face was a blank mask, but a dangerous stillness had settled over him, the kind of quiet that comes before a lightning strike. "You will not speak of her," Eli said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Haskins laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I'll speak of her how I please. She's a charity case living in a shack, and you're a killer I pay to mend my fences. You're letting a piece of damaged goods distract you from your work. It ends. You stay away from her, or you can find another man to pay you to drink yourself to death. You understand me?" The insult to himself. Eli could have borne. He had heard worse 1,000 times, but the casual, cruel dismissal of Clara, the way Haskins spoke her name as if it were dirt, that was a line Haskins should not have crossed. "I understand," Eli said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "I will not work for a man who speaks that way of a good woman. I'm done." He turned to walk away, to collect his few belongings and leave the ranch for good. Haskins, stunned by the defiance, reacted with pure, brutish anger. He lunged forward, grabbing Eli's shoulder. "No man quits on me," he snarled. Eli shook off the hand with a speed that was startling. What happened next was a blur of dust and fury. Haskins threw a wild, clumsy punch. Eli deflected it easily, but he did not strike back. He simply stood his ground, a rock against which Haskins' rage broke, infuriated by his calm. Haskins charged, and 2 other ranch hands, eager to curry favor with their boss, moved in to surround Eli. It was no longer a fight. It was a beating. A fist caught Eli on the side of the head, sending a spray of blood from his lip. A boot connected with his ribs, and he grunted in pain, staggering back. Still, he did not draw his weapon. His hands remained at his sides. He would not kill for this. He absorbed the blows, his body a shield for his principles, until a heavy, swinging punch from Haskins sent him crashing to the ground. He lay there in the dust of the corral, the taste of blood and dirt in his mouth, as Haskins stood over him, breathing heavily. "Get off my land," Haskins spat, wiping a trickle of blood from his own knuckle. "And if I see you near that woman again, I'll have my boys finish this." Eli lay still until they were gone, until the only sound was the soft nicker of the horses and the buzz of flies. Every muscle screamed in protest as he slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet. One eye was swelling shut. His ribs felt like they were on fire, and his body was a map of fresh bruises. He was injured, unemployed, and more alone than ever. He retrieved his saddle and his gun belt from the bunkhouse and began the long, slow walk back to town, each step an agony. Clara saw him from her window. She saw him staggering along the dusty track that led from the Haskins ranch, his body stooped in pain, his face a swollen, bloody mess. A gasp escaped her lips, a mixture of horror and a fierce, protective anger. She did not hesitate. She ran from her cabin, her heart pounding in her chest, and met him on the road. "Eli," she breathed, her hands hovering, afraid to touch him for fear of causing more pain. He tried to wave her away. "Go back, Clara, it's nothing." "You are bleeding," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You will come with me, now." She half supported him, her small frame straining under his weight. As she led him the last few yards to her cabin, she pushed him gently onto her narrow bed, the only soft place in the room. Her hands trembled as she fetched the basin of water and the clean rags she used for her sewing. She worked in a focused, desperate silence, cleaning the cuts on his face, her touch as gentle as a prayer. He winced as she dabbed at a deep gash on his cheekbone, but he did not pull away. She tended to him secretly, under the cloak of darkness. She knew the danger. To harbor him, the man who had brawled with the most powerful rancher in the territory, was to invite a wrath she could not possibly withstand. But she did not care. He had suffered this for her. He had taken a beating to defend her honor. To turn him away would be the greatest sin of all. For 3 days, she hid him in her small room. She kept the shutters closed, telling anyone who came for mending that she was unwell. She fed him broth and bread, changed his bandages, and sat by his side as he drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. In those quiet, stolen hours, their bond deepened into something unbreakable. She saw him not as the fearsome gunman or the silent outcast, but as a man in pain, a man who was vulnerable. She saw the deep weariness in him, the toll of a lifetime of violence and solitude. And he, in his moments of clarity, saw her. He watched her as she moved about the small room, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched a new bandage. He saw the strength that lay beneath her quiet exterior, a resilience that the world had tried and failed to crush. Their love, born in silence and shared hardship, was now sealed in this secret, tender intimacy. The peril of their situation only made it more precious. They were two fugitives, hiding from a hostile world, and in that small, candlelit room, they were all the world each other had. But secrets in a town like Redemption have a short lifespan. Someone saw Eli stumble toward Clara's cabin. Someone else noticed the closed shutters and the lack of smoke from her chimney. The whispers, which had died down to a low murmur, erupted into a furious roar. The story twisted itself into a grotesque new shape. The fallen woman was now hiding a violent brawler, a man who had attacked his employer. They were two of a kind, a stain on the fabric of the community. On Sunday, the town pastor, Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was matched only by his lack of compassion, took to his pulpit. He did not speak Clara's name, but everyone knew who he meant. He thundered against the Jezebel in their midst, the sinner who tempted good men to violence and lived in open defiance of God's law. He spoke of the moral sickness she had brought to their town and declared that the house of the Lord must be purified. By the end of the sermon, her fate was sealed. She was formally banned from the church, the very building she had swept clean, the place where she had tried to build something good, the sanctuary whose benches and door Eli had mended with his own hands, was now forbidden to her. The last door in town had been slammed shut in her face. It was on a Tuesday, when the afternoon stagecoach rolled in, that her past came to call. A man stepped out, A man so out of place in the dust and decay of redemption that he seemed like a creature from another world. He wore a fine wool suit, a polished bowler hat, and his shoes were immaculate. He looked around, his expression a mixture of distaste and confusion. It was Jonathan Moore. Clara was on her way back from the well when she saw him. Her heart stopped. Jonathan had been her husband's business partner and, before that, her suitor. He was a man of wealth and impeccable social standing, a man who represented everything she had lost. He saw her at the same moment, and his face registered a profound shock. He saw not the elegant Mrs. Monroe he had known, but a thin, weary woman in a faded calico dress, her hands rough from work and carrying 2 heavy water buckets. "Clara?" he asked, his voice full of a disbelief that was more insulting than any curse. "My God, what has become of you?" He insisted on walking her back to her cabin, his polished shoes looking absurd in the thick dust. He could barely conceal his horror at the sight of her small, dilapidated home. Inside, Eli was awake, sitting in the shadows, his bruised face a testament to the life Clara now lived. The 2 men looked at each other, a chasm of class and experience separating them. Jonathan, ever the businessman, got straight to the point. "I came to settle Arthur's last affairs," he said to Clara, pointedly ignoring Eli. "I had no idea things were this dire. This is no place for you. Clara, this is savagery." He made his offer that evening, after Eli had quietly slipped out to give them privacy. "Come back east with me," Jonathan said, his voice earnest. He stood in the center of her small room, looking uncomfortable and proprietary. "I will take care of you. We can be married. I will restore your name, your position. You can have a proper home, servants, beautiful clothes. You can leave all of this squalor, behind you." It was a lifeline. It was a golden bridge back to the world she had been raised in, a world of comfort, security, and respectability, a world where people did not stare at her with contempt, where she did not have to count every penny or worry about a leaking roof. All she had to do was say yes. All she had to do was leave Eli. She looked at Jonathan, at his well-fed face and his clean, soft hands, and she saw a comfortable cage, beautifully gilded, but a cage nonetheless. She was torn. Her mind screamed at her to accept, to flee this harsh, unforgiving life. But her heart, a stubborn, foolish thing, ached at the thought of leaving the quiet, broken man who had shown her what it truly meant to be seen. She did not give him an answer immediately. Later that night, Eli returned. He had been outside, listening. He knew. "He is right," Eli said, his voice rough. He would not look at her. "This is no life for you. You belong back there. With him, he can give you things, a name, a home. All I can give you is trouble." He was pushing her away, trying to save her from himself. He was sacrificing his own heart for her safety, believing, in his profound humility, that he was not worthy of her. "You should go. Clara." His words were like a physical blow, heartbroken and confused. She began to pack her few belongings into a small traveling bag. It did not take long. A few dresses, a book, her sewing kit. Her whole life in this town fit into a single valise. Jonathan was right. She had nothing here. Eli had left his gun belt on a nail by the door when she had helped him inside days ago. As she packed, her hand brushed against the heavy leather. She took it down, intending to give it back to him. The leather was worn and supple, smelling faintly of oil and dust. It felt like a part of him. As she held it, her fingers traced the intricate tooling, and then slipped inside, against the unfinished flap that would lie against his body. And then she felt it. It was not a flaw in the leather. It was a series of small, deliberate ridges. She turned the holster toward the candlelight, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. There, carved into the hidden leather in a careful, unsteady hand, was a single word, her name, C-L-A-R. R.A. The sight broke her. Tears she had not shed for all her hardship now streamed down her face. This was not a public declaration. It was a secret, a vow known only to him. It was a brand he had placed not on her, but on himself. It spoke of a love that was not possessive or demanding, but quiet, constant, and pure. It was not lust that had drawn him to her. It was this deep, abiding love that he kept hidden from the world. In that moment, all her confusion vanished, replaced by a fierce, unshakable clarity. A life of safety with Jonathan would be a lie. It would be a slow death of the soul. Her life, her real life, was here, in this dusty, broken town, with this broken, beautiful man, even if it meant being an outcast forever. When Jonathan returned the next morning, expecting her to be ready, she met him at the door. "I am not going," she said, her voice calm and steady. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What? Do not be a fool. Clara, this is your last chance." "This is my home now," she said, "and I'm not leaving it." He looked past her, into the dim interior of the cabin, and understood. His face hardened with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You would throw away everything for him? For a penniless, backwoods killer? You truly have lost your mind." He shook his head, a man utterly defeated by a logic he could not grasp. "You are a fool. Clara Monroe, a fool." He turned and walked away without another word, a man retreating back to his world of sense and commerce, leaving her to what he saw as her ruin. That night, Eli returned to her. He found her sitting at the small table, the single candle lit between them, just as it had been on the night of the storm. She looked up as he entered, and the love in her eyes was a tangible thing, a light that banished all the shadows. He walked to her, and she rose to meet him. They did not need to speak. Their choice was made. They were together, a tiny island in a hostile sea. But outside, in the darkness of the Dust Devil Saloon, their fragile peace was already being undone. Silas Haskins, his pride still wounded, bought a round of whiskey for a group of sullen, resentful men. He spoke of the gunman who thought he was too good for honest work, and the fallen woman who harbored him. Their words were poison, their resentment curdling into a dark and violent plan. Under the endless, uncaring stars of the western night, men whispered and planned violence, their hatred a gathering storm that was about to break over the small, candle-lit cabin at the edge of town. The peace they had found was as fragile as a candle flame in a high wind, and the wind was coming. It began, as most trouble in redemption did, in the smoky, whiskey-soaked confines of the Dust Devil Saloon. The air was thick with resentment, a poison expertly stirred by Silas Haskins. He had lost a good hand, but more than that. His authority had been challenged, and his pride was a raw, festering wound. He bought drinks for men whose lives were as empty as their pockets, filling them with cheap liquor and a righteous, borrowed anger. The talk was of Eli Carter. They called him a coward who hid behind a woman's skirts, an arrogant killer who thought he was better than them. The target of their hatred was absent, but one of the men at the bar, a drifter with a mean streak, took offense at some imagined slight from his neighbor. A shove became a curse became a clumsy, swinging punch. Eli had been at the back of the room, nursing a single beer, his mind 1,000 miles away in Clara's small, warm cabin. He had only come for a bottle to take back, wanting to avoid this very thing. When the fight broke out, he moved instinctively, not to join it, but to end it. He stepped between the two grappling men, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "That is enough." For a moment, they froze, surprised by his sudden appearance. But they were too drunk for reason. The drifter, seeing Carter as a new and more interesting challenge, swung a wild fist. As Eli sidestepped the blow, the man stumbled backward, crashing into a table, a kerosene lamp, its wick burning high, tipped over. It shattered on the dry, splintered floorboards, and In an instant, a whoosh of orange flame erupted, greedily consuming the spilled fuel. Panic exploded. The men who had been spoiling for a fight now scrambled for the doors, their drunken courage evaporating in the face of the sudden, scorching heat. Eli grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the wall and tried to beat back the flames, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a tin cup. The fire leaped from the floor to the bar, igniting the bottles of cheap whiskey, which exploded in a series of sharp reports. Thick, black smoke filled the room, choking and blinding. Realizing it was a lost cause, Eli fought his way out, his lungs burning, his face blackened with soot. He emerged into the night to a scene of growing chaos. The entire town was awake, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid fascination in the hellish, flickering light. The saloon was an inferno, a roaring beast that threatened to consume the whole dry wooden town. And then the finger of blame was pointed. Silas Haskins, his face a mask of righteous fury, stood on the opposite side of the street. "It was Carter," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "I saw it. He started the fight, knocked over the lamp. He tried to burn us all alive." The lie was as brazen as it was effective. The crowd, their minds already poisoned against Eli, needed no convincing. Their fear and anger, searching for a target, settled on the solitary, soot-stained figure standing apart from them all. The whispers turned to shouts, the shouts to a single, bloodthirsty cry. They were no longer a crowd. They were a mob. "Get him!" a voice screamed. Eli saw the shift in their eyes. The moment reason died and madness took hold. He did not run in fear, but with a grim, calculated purpose. They would not listen to him. They wanted blood. He broke from the firelight and melted into the familiar shadows at the edge of town. But he could hear them coming, the thunder of their boots, the raw, animal sound of their rage. Men appeared with rifles and torches, their face twisted into ugly masks by the dancing light. They were vigilantes now, self-appointed judges and executioners. He moved through the darkness, a ghost in his own town, every instinct screaming at him to ride out, to disappear into the vast, empty plains where a man could lose himself forever. But his feet did not carry him toward the open range. They carried him, with an unerring magnetic pull, to the one place in the world that meant anything to him. They carried him to Clara. He slipped through her back door like a shadow, his hand gently covering her mouth as she gasped in surprise. "It is me," he whispered, his voice a raw rasp. "Do not be afraid." She saw the soot on his face, the wildness in his eyes, and she knew. What happened? "Fire," he said, the word tasting like ash. "They are blaming me." Even as he spoke, they could hear the shouts of the mob growing closer, a wave of hatred rolling through the town. "Where is he hiding? Check the stables. He will not get far." Clara's face was pale in the candlelight, but her eyes were clear and resolute. There was no fear in them, only a fierce, protective certainty. She bolted the door and drew the thin curtains across the window. She pulled him toward a small, dark root cellar hidden beneath a loose floorboard, a space barely large enough for a man to crouch in. "Get in," she commanded, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "They will not find you here." He hesitated. "Clara, if they find me here, they will hurt you." "Get in," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "I will not let them have you." He lowered himself into the dark, earthen-smelling space. She replaced the floorboard and dragged a heavy wooden chest over it just as the first heavy, brutal knock came at the door. "Clara Monroe!" a voice roared. It was Haskins. "We know he is in there. Send him out!" Clara took a deep breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She smoothed her dress, a small, defiant gesture of composure, and opened the door a crack. She was met with a wall of angry, torch-lit faces. Haskins stood at the front, but behind him were dozens of men, their eyes glowing with a feverish, mob-born courage. Marshal Gideon Hayes stood to one side, his face grim and weary. He was a man caught in a torrent, clinging to the last vestiges of the law.
"What is the meaning of this, Mr. Haskins?"
Clara asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Do not play the innocent with us, woman," Haskins sneered. "You are hiding the arsonist. Carter, we want him."
"There is no one here but me,"
she said, her chin held high. The marshal stepped forward, his expression pained. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and heavy with regret. "Folks saw him run this way. A dozen men are saying he started that fire. If you are hiding him, you are harboring a fugitive. That is a serious crime." He looked from her face to the angry mob and back again. He was giving her a choice, a last chance to save herself. "Tell me where he is. Mrs. Monroe. Let the law handle this, or you will have to stand trial yourself. I cannot protect you from that." The silence that followed was absolute. Below the floorboards, Eli held his breath, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. He could hear every word. He could hear the thumping of his own heart. He waited for her answer, for the betrayal that he knew was the only sensible choice for her to make. Clara looked at the marshal, then let her gaze sweep over the hateful faces of the mob. Men who had judged her, condemned her, and now threatened to destroy her. She thought of her life before Eli, a gray, empty existence of duty and silent despair. Then she thought of the man hiding in her cellar, the man who had mended her fence, defended her honor, and carved her name on his own soul. The choice was not a choice at all.
"No,"
she said. The word was quiet, but it rang through the night with the force of a gunshot. "I will not." Haskins's face twisted in triumph. "She admits it! He is in there!" The mob surged forward. Two of Haskins' men grabbed Clara by the arms, their grips bruisingly tight, and dragged her from the doorway. She did not scream or struggle. She held her head high, her dignity a silent rebuke to their savagery. They threw her into the dusty street, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. The mockery began, a torrent of vile, ugly words. "The killer's woman," one man shouted. "Look at the fine city lady, down in the dirt where she belongs," another jeered. They circled her like wolves, their torches casting a demonic, dancing light on her pale, resolute face. Then they turned on her home. With a roar of collective rage, they poured into the small cabin. They were not searching, they were destroying. They smashed her chair, overturned her bed, and shattered the small porcelain basin she washed in each morning. They ripped her mending work to shreds, the fruits of her long, lonely hours of labor scattered like confetti on the floor. From a crack in the floorboards, Eli watched it all. He saw them drag her into the street. He heard their taunts. He saw the systematic, brutal destruction of her small, fragile world. He had brought this upon her. His presence, his love, was a curse that had finally brought her to ruin. Every jeer they threw at her was a lash across his own back. Every piece of her life they shattered was a piece of his own soul breaking. He could not stay hidden. He could not let her pay the price for his life. To remain in the darkness while she suffered in the light was a cowardice he could not live with. With a surge of strength, he pushed against the floorboard above him. The heavy chest shifted. The men inside the cabin froze. Turning toward the sound, Eli pushed again, throwing the chest aside, and rose from the cellar like a specter of vengeance. The men in the cabin scrambled back, their bravado vanishing in the face of the man himself. Eli's face was a mask of cold, deadly fury. His eyes were not on them. They were fixed on Clara, kneeling in the dirt, her face streaked with tears she refused to let fall. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice low and lethal. The mob outside fell silent as he stepped out of the cabin, his hands held open at his sides, away from his gun. He walked directly to Clara, ignoring the rifles that were now trained on him. He knelt before her in the dust, in front of the entire town, and gently brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek.
"I am sorry. Clara,"
he whispered, his voice thick with a pain that went deeper than any beating. She looked at him, her eyes shining with a love that was fierce and unbreakable. This was not the end. It was a declaration. She rose to her feet, and he rose with her. Then, in front of the marshal, in front of Silas Haskins, in front of the entire mob that wanted him dead, she reached up, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. It was a kiss of profound and desperate love, a final act of defiance against a world that had tried to tear them apart. As she pulled away, she whispered the words that were the truest thing she had ever said, for his ears only. "You are the only thing that ever made me feel alive." The moment was broken by Haskins's enraged roar. "Get him!" The mob fell upon Eli. He did not fight back. He stood and took the blows, his body shielding Clara from the surge. They beat him with their fists and the butts of their rifles until he fell to his knees, and then to the ground. Marshal Hayes finally pushed his way through, his revolver drawn and pointed at the sky. "That is enough," he yelled, his voice cracking with strain. "He has surrendered. He will be jailed. The law will see to this now." Reluctantly, the mob fell back, their bloodlust sated for the moment. They dragged Eli's battered, semi-conscious body toward the small, stone jailhouse at the end of the street. Clara tried to follow, but the marshal blocked her path. "Please," she begged, her voice ragged. "He did not do it. Haskins lied." "It is out of my hands now. Mrs. Monroe," the marshal said, his eyes full of a weary pity. "There will be a trial. A circuit judge will be through in a month." "A month," she cried. "They will not wait a month. They will hang him." The marshal had no answer for that. He simply shook his head and turned away. A good man who knew he had lost control of his town. They threw Eli into a dark, squalid cell, the iron door clanging shut with a sound of absolute finality. Clara was left alone in the street, surrounded by the wreckage of her home and her life. But she did not retreat. She walked to the jailhouse and sat down in the dust outside the small, barred window of his cell. As the town slowly settled back into a nervous, watchful silence, she took out a small candle and a match from her apron pocket. With trembling hands, she lit the wick. The tiny flame flickered, a fragile, defiant pinprick of light against the immense, crushing darkness of the night. She held it in her hands, a silent, solitary vigil. She had lost her faith in God long ago, but she had not lost her faith in him. And so she prayed, not with words, but with the steady, unwavering light of her candle, a beacon for the man she loved. Inside, Eli pulled his bruised body to the bars. He could see her through the window, a small, unshakable figure bathed in the soft, golden glow of her candle. He saw her devotion, her sacrifice. He saw the love that had cost them both everything. A profound, aching sorrow filled him. Not for himself, but for her. He knew what the dawn would bring. The mob would not wait for a judge. They would come for him at sunrise. He watched her through the bars, her face a pale, beautiful icon in the darkness, and knew it was the last thing he would ever see. The sun rose on the day of the execution, not with a gentle, hopeful glow, but with a harsh, blood-red light that bled across the horizon, staining the dust and the grim faces of the townspeople. They gathered in the main street, a silent, shuffling congregation drawn by a morbid gravity. A crude gallows had been erected overnight, its raw timber frame a stark, ugly skeleton against the morning sky. The saloon, a blackened, smoldering husk, served as a grim backdrop, a monument to the lie that had brought them to this moment. Then, a path opened in the crowd, a collective, uneasy murmur rippled through them as they turned to look. Clara was walking toward the gallows. She was barefoot, the sharp stones and grit of the street a penance she had chosen for herself. Her face was pale, and a dark bruise marred her cheek where one of the men had shoved her the night before. But her head was high, and her eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion and grief, were clear and unbroken. She did not look at the faces in the crowd. the men and women who had whispered about her, judged her, and then stood by while her world was torn apart. She looked only at the jailhouse and the gallows that stood before it. Marshal Hayes stood at the foot of the scaffold, his face gray and haggard. He looked like a man who had not slept, a man haunted by the weakness he had shown. Clara stopped before him, her small, barefoot figure a stark contrast to the armed men who flanked him. "Marshal," she said, her voice low but carrying in the tense silence, "you cannot do this. You know this is not justice. It is murder." The marshal flinched at the word but did not meet her eyes. "He surrendered, Mrs. Monroe. He will get a trial when the judge arrives. He will be dead before the sun is high in the sky, and you know it," she countered, her voice trembling with a desperate intensity. "This is not the law. This is a mob. You are letting Silas Haskins and his lies dictate the law in this town. I am begging you, for the sake of whatever decency is left in this place, do not let them do this." "It is out of my hands," he said, his voice a miserable, defeated mumble. "The town wants this. I cannot stop it." "Then you are a coward, as well as a fool," she said, her voice ringing with a contempt that made several in the crowd shuffle their feet and look away. From the door of the jailhouse, Eli appeared, flanked by two of Haskins' men who were now acting as deputies. He was bruised and battered, his face swollen, a deep cut on his forehead, but he walked with a steady, unbroken gait. His eyes found Clara immediately, a silent, anguished message passing between them. He saw her bare feet, her bruised face, and a pain deeper than any physical blow passed across his features. He stopped before the marshal. "I have one last wish," he said, his voice a rough, gravelly thing. The marshal, perhaps moved by a final, fleeting pang of conscience, nodded. "What is it, Carter?" "I want to speak with her," he said, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. "Alone?" A grumble went through the crowd, but the marshal raised a hand for silence. "Give them 5 minutes," he ordered, his tone holding a sliver of its old authority. They led him back into the dim stone-walled cell. Clara followed, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The deputies locked the heavy iron door behind her, leaving them in the gloom. The only light came from the single sputtering candle she had brought with her, the one she had held vigil with all through the long, terrible night. Its small flame cast their shadows, huge and distorted, against the damp stone walls. They did not speak for a long moment. They simply stood, separated by the cold iron bars, their fingers lacing together through the gap. His hands were rough and calloused. Hers were trembling. "You should not have done this," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "You should have let Jonathan take you away from here." "And lived a half-life in a gilded cage?" she asked, her voice soft but fierce. "My life did not begin until I met you, Eli. It was just waiting. You taught me what it was to feel something real." He looked at their joined hands, at the flickering candle flame. "I have brought you nothing but ruin." "You brought me everything that matters," she said. He finally raised his eyes to hers, and she saw the raw, unbearable pain in them. "I have to know," she whispered. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" He held her gaze, and in the depths of his pale, winter sky eyes, she saw the truth. A small, sad smile touched his bruised lips. "I do not regret a single moment," he said, his voice clear and true. Tears she had refused to shed now welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She leaned her forehead against the cold bars, her voice a choked whisper. "Then neither do I." The heavy tread of boots outside the cell door signaled that their time was up. The deputies unlocked the door, their faces impatient. They pulled Eli away from the bars, away from her. He did not look back. He could not. They led him to the gallows. He walked up the 13 steps without faltering, his gaze fixed on some distant point on the horizon. a place beyond the hate and the dust of this town. They put the rough hemp rope around his neck. Haskins stood in the front of the crowd, his face a mask of smug, triumphant satisfaction. The marshal began to read the trumped-up charges in a monotone voice, the words a meaningless drone against the pounding in Clara's ears. She stood rooted to the spot, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, watching the man she loved prepare to die. The marshal finished reading. A terrible, profound silence fell over the town. The executioner, a hulking man with a hood over his face, moved toward the lever. And then they heard it. It was a faint sound at first, a distant, rhythmic drumming that grew steadily louder. Every head in the crowd turned, looking down the long, empty street that led out of town. A rider was coming. A lone figure bent low over his horse's neck, galloping with a desperate, frantic urgency. The horse was a fine bay, but it was lathered in sweat, its sides heaving, ridden to the very edge of its endurance. The rider did not slow as he entered the town. He raced directly toward the gallows, pulling the horse to a skidding, dramatic halt that sent up a cloud of red dust. He was a young man, a deputy from the next county over, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. He vaulted from the saddle, clutching a piece of paper in his hand. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice hoarse and breathless. "In the name of the law, stop!" Marshal Hayes, looking stunned, held up a hand to the executioner. The deputy stumbled forward, pushing his way through the bewildered crowd. "This man is innocent," the deputy gasped, waving the paper. "We caught the drifter who started the fight. Name of Jedediah Smith. He got drunk in our town last night and confessed to everything. Said he was the one who knocked over the lamp. Said he was aiming for Carter but was too drunk to hit him. He said Silas Haskins paid him $50 to put the blame on Carter." He shoved the paper, a sworn confession witnessed by his own sheriff, into Marshal Hayes's hands. "It is all here. Carter tried to put the fire out." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Every eye turned from the deputy to Silas Haskins. The rancher's face, which had been a mask of triumph, had gone a sickly, ashen color. The lie had been exposed. His power, built on fear and intimidation, crumbled to dust in the harsh morning light. He took a half step back, then another, before turning and trying to push his way through the crowd, to disappear. But the people did not move for him. The men who had been his loyal followers just hours before now stared at him with cold, dead eyes. Marshal Hayes, his face a mixture of shame and dawning resolve, finally found his voice. He drew his revolver, the first decisive action he had taken in days. "Silas Haskins," he said, his voice loud and clear, "you are under arrest for conspiracy and incitement to riot." On the gallows, they removed the rope from Eli's neck. He stood there for a long moment, blinking in the bright sunlight, as if waking from a long and terrible dream. Then his legs gave way, and he stumbled down the steps. Clara ran to him. She did not say a word. She simply collapsed against his chest, her body racked with great, shuddering sobs of relief. All the terror, all the grief, all the strength she had held on to for so long, finally broke free. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just tried to kill him. The crowd dispersed in a wave of profound and heavy shame. They could not bear to look at the two people they had so eagerly condemned. They shuffled back to their homes, the morning's righteous fury replaced by a sickening, hollow guilt. They had almost hanged an innocent man. They had almost let their own fear and hatred turn them into murderers. The town of redemption had looked into the abyss, and it did not like what it had seen. Later that day, after the marshal had locked a protesting Haskins in the very same cell Eli had occupied, Eli and Clara stood in the ruins of her small cabin. He had made his decision. "I am leaving," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Clara looked at him, her heart sinking.
"But you are free. Eli, you are innocent."
"Innocence does not matter here," he said, gesturing to the wrecked room, to the town beyond. This land is cursed. It is full of ghosts and hate. Every face I see will be a reminder of that rope around my neck. I cannot wash the memory of this place from my soul, but I can ride away from it. I will not stay here to be haunted. He was right. She knew he was. There was nothing for them here but bitter memories and accusatory stares.
Then I am going with you,
she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He looked at her, a protest forming on his lips. Clara, you do not know the life I live. It is hard, nothing but dust and open sky. There is no comfort in it.
You are my comfort,
she replied, her voice unwavering. My home is not a place, Eli, it is you. Wherever you go, that is where I belong. I will not be left behind. He looked into her eyes and saw a strength and a certainty that matched his own. He had spent his whole life alone, but he was not alone anymore. He reached out and took her hand. A slow smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, spread across his face. They left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a small sack of provisions, and the 2 horses Eli had bought with the last of his money. They did not look back. They rode away from the skeletal mines, from the burned-out saloon, from the gallows that still stood as a monument to the town's shame. They rode out together, into the vast, open plains, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of everything that had condemned them. The final scene of their story in that town was not an ending, but a beginning. That night, miles from anywhere, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, a single candle flickered inside a small, canvas tent. The world outside was a vast, howling darkness, the wind a lonely voice sweeping across the endless land. It was still a cruel world, a hard world, but for the first time, they were not facing it alone. She sat close to him, wrapped in a blanket, the candlelight softening the lines of weariness on their faces. She looked at him, at this quiet, scarred man who was now her whole world, and she smiled.
I shouldn't want a cowboy,
she said softly, her voice full of a tender, loving warmth. He turned to her, his pale eyes glowing in the candlelight, and his hand found hers in the darkness. Then do not, he answered, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Just need one. Thank you for being with us through this journey. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.